And hello, everyone. A very good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. I'd love to know where you're watching from. That's one of the first things I like people to put into the chat for everyone who's already here. Oh, it's good to see everyone in the chat already. Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Good to see everyone. And We've got a whole bunch of people in here. I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes to get rolling. This is also the time of the live stream where I want to check that the audio is coming through all right. It's not too soft. It's not too loud. There's no other noises, etc. Whether the picture's coming through all right. If everyone can see me and hear me, just let me know in the chat. That's just a little bit of a, you'd think, as I say, always, you'd think by now I'd have this all down, but I'm getting better. I haven't had hiccups right at the beginning of a live stream. Dallas, Texas, good to see you here. First time in a live stream. Welcome. So for everyone who's joining us for the first time, thank you very much for taking the time. If you're watching this later in the recording, but this is the first For the Love of Comics video that you're watching, a warm welcome to the channel. And for those of you who are regular viewers or even semi-regular viewers watching either live or later on a recording, welcome back. This live stream does have a topic. I usually like to have a topic with live streams, but sometimes they can be a bit rambly. Who am I kidding? They're often very rambly, and that's why I pick certain topics to be live streams so that I can ramble a little bit. It's not necessarily about a definite list of things that I want to say, and that's all. I'm also not sure if what I'm saying will sound correct to me once I've said it out loud, so I might go back and forth. But it's also a good opportunity to have conversation with people in the chat having conversations with each other. But I think about many of these live streams as conversations. So I like to pick topics that seem to me to be good conversation topics. And today's live stream is one such topic. And actually, this has been a topic that I've been thinking about for many years now. Not consciously as let's make a video on this topic, but it's just something I deal with very often. A lot of people ask me for recommendations. A lot of people ask me which comic should I read, or I've never read any comics, or I haven't read any comics since I was very young. Which comic should I read? And in many ways, my entire channel is a list of recommendations. Anything I've made a video on or featured in a video in some way will be a recommendation of some sort or the other. I find it to be worthwhile, and that's why I'm talking about it. But as I was saying in the description for this video, I also like it when people say, I've really enjoyed this and this. What else can I watch? Or what else can I read? Or what can I read that's similar to this thing that I like in movies? What can I read that's similar to this thing that I like in prose? It can be genre. Someone can say, I want something sci-fi. They can be a little bit more specific. They can be a little bit more broad. They can be very peculiar. I saw on the For the Love of Comics Discord channel some months ago, someone saying, I feel like reading something with spaceships, and I completely understand that feeling. Oh, Sumit Kumar from Buckermax is here in the chat. Hi, Sumit. Thank you so much for the super chat. It's very generous, and thank you so much for joining us on this live stream. If you haven't checked out buckermax.com, it is an animation and comics website. They make some very interesting stuff, very clever stuff, very funny stuff. Perhaps not to everyone's tastes, but I think of that website as a very unique thing in Indian comics. So I would heartily recommend you at least give it a look and give a number of their comics a look. If you don't like this, go on to the next one. You'd be surprised at the level of intertextuality that they're able to weave into some things that on the surface can seem rather I'll let you take a look at that website. It's very interesting, very cool, especially if you are in India. So thank you so much for joining us, Sumit. Hope you can stick around for a while. So I was saying that one of the things I really enjoy is when people say, I like this. what else can you recommend for me that's similar to that? Or what else can I read that would be continuing along those lines? And it can be a number of different ways of approaching it, as I said, either through genre or through plot points, or I want something that is historical, I want something that is fantasy. Those are common kind of things. But sometimes people also refer to specific works and said, I really enjoyed that one thing. What can you tell me that's similar to that? Or what can you tell me, if I enjoyed that, what else will I enjoy? And two of the most common things that are brought up as references are the Adventures of Tintin and the Adventures of Asterix by Herge and by Goscinny and Uderzo, respectively. Because I think a lot of people have read these comics when they were young. For many people, they may be the only comics they've ever read, or that might be all they know of comics. Now, for a lot of us who are comics aficionados and read a lot of comics, etc., that might feel strange, but comics reading isn't, I think sometimes it's easy to forget that it's not as popular as we think of it, because we only talk to people who also share our love for comics and also read a lot of comics. Comics reading isn't that popular compared to other kinds of reading. And of course, other kinds of reading are also becoming less and less popular, and that's a whole other thing. But when people are interested, and especially when they talk to me, they're often curious as, what appeals, to you about comics. And that's a huge topic to get into. And rather than get into the philosophy of comics and structure, I'd much rather give them a comic to read and say, read this. And especially if they're readers, especially if they like to read, if they like to read prose, if they like to read other forms of writing and storytelling, I just would prefer to give them something that will prove my case rather than try to make my case in an abstract fashion. So that's why I like giving recommendations. That's why I like when people tell me what they've liked, because then I get to curate stuff. And this live stream is an attempt to do just that. It's an attempt to cull all these years of recommendations that I've given to people, specifically to people who've said, I loved Tintin when I was a kid. What can I read next? Or I have never read any comics since I read Tintin as a child, or since I read Asterix. What can I read as an adult? And of course, there are people who may not be interested for themselves, but are interested for their children or for some other young reader in their lives, where they'd be like, what can I give to them now that I've given them Tintin and Asterix? Because that's all I know. So I often ask, so what else does the kid like? So today's list may be focused a little bit on that all ages aspect of it too. And I make the point all ages as opposed to for children, because I think, especially when it comes to movies, if something is specifically for children, adults may or may not get enjoyment out of it. And it's rarer that adults get enjoyment out of something that is specifically for kids because of various trappings and because of various, formula or ways of presenting that just don't appeal to adults after a certain point of time. However, all ages, I think, is a slightly different thing, where it's honestly something that all ages can enjoy. What that means is the material doesn't necessarily contain something that you wouldn't want children to read or children wouldn't get at all. Now, I don't think there are things like what children wouldn't get at all, on this list, but that's something. That's the second part that I'll get to as far as this list. So first of all, this list is probably going to focus a little bit. Sorry, let me just adjust my screen. Yeah, I think that's better. There's something weird going on with the lines. Anyway, so all ages reading is one aspect of, I think, the reason why Tintin and Asterix have an appeal. At least one of the many reasons why they have an appeal is because they are all ages reading. They're not specifically for kids. They're not specifically for adults. They're things anyone can enjoy. They're things parents can enjoy with their children. It's things teenagers can enjoy. And it's things that we can enjoy from nostalgia and from an adult appreciation. So that's one of the first things that I think I've tried to put together with this list. The second thing that I've tried to put together with this list is an approach that I use for most lists of mine. Sorry, it's a little warm in here. this list is not meant to be a list of things that you will enjoy, or you'll enjoy each and every one of it guaranteed, because they're not similar to each other. What I've tried to do is try to make a list in which at least one or two things would be of interest to you. But if they're not, maybe another one will, maybe another one will. And that's because people's tastes may vary. What they like in Tintin and Asterix isn't going to be exactly the same. It's not a facsimile, of the same stories. So it's not going to be exactly the same. And the way it's not the same may appeal to some people and it may not to others. So rather than try to be consistent with the list and end up with a list of books that are all very similar to each other, I've deliberately tried to pick books that are very different from each other while still having this kind of connection that I'm talking about, this reference connection. All right, so the way that I'm going to approach this is it's going to be, again, for people who have been on my other live streams or seen other videos of mine, they'll probably not be surprised to hear that although I've titled this live stream 10 comics to read after Tintin and Asterix, I'm going to be talking about more than 10 comics. And I'll be talking about more than 10 comics to try to explain what connects and what caveats I have. However, people may also be surprised that I'm not going to have that many honorable mentions. And I'm going to be much closer to 10 comics than I have been to 10 comics when I've said 10 comics in the past. And the reason is, I'm not saying this is the top 10 comics to read after Tintin and Asterix. I'm not saying these are the 10 best, and they absolutely must be read before anything else. These are just 10 great comics that would make a great stepping stone from having read Tintin and Asterix to reading other comics. There could be 10 others, there could be 30 others, there could be 50 others, and there are. So I think if this is something that people enjoy, and if this is something that people find useful for themselves or for other people for gifting and for recommendations, I could easily make 10 more comics to read after Tintin and Asterix, or 10 more. It could easily be a series. Of course, it'll get more and more challenging because maybe my most obvious reactions would have already been taken out in earlier videos. But that's for a later time. So this is not a top 10. These are 10 great comics that I think make for great next reading after Tintin and Asterix. The specific reasons why I'll get into when I talk about each of these comics. I will talk about more than 10 comics, but not that many as far as honorable mentions, because I will probably want to revisit this topic. What I would like everyone to also do, whether you're watching it live, you can put it in the chat. If you're watching it later, put it in the comments. I'd like to know which 10 comics you would pick if you're an expert. If you're not an expert, I would say, look at these comments, look at these chats. There are a lot of experts in this community, much more knowledgeable than me in many, many ways. So their recommendations should be taken alongside mine to create a whole library. So you go from saying, what else is there to read, or what should I read, to being, what do I read first? What am I going to start with? All right, I'm just going to quickly check to see if there are any questions or comments that I should get to before I jump right into it. I hope everyone's doing well. Hello to all of you who've joined since. Do I get the ability to... I'm trying to do something that I haven't done before, but I don't know if I'm succeeding. I'm trying to put a chat up on the screen or something like that, but I guess it doesn't work. I tested it earlier and it seemed to work, and now it doesn't. So that's just my luck. Anyway. Tommy says we should declare a new FTLOC numeric system where the main takeaways 10 can never actually be 10. Yes, I think that's fair. That's fair to say. Of all the Tintins, okay, so we've got some conversation. It is really warm in here. I don't know what's going to happen when summer really kicks in here in New Delhi, because I don't think I'll be able to make these videos without having the air conditioner on, and then the audio is going to get... Anyway, that is not for right now. I can see some lists already in the chat. People are already naming things that they would have up there. But all right, let's get started. I am going to start with... All right, I'm giving up on this chat thing, although I tried, but unfortunately, I can't get it to work. All right, you can keep leaving me chats. I will turn to this screen from time to time, but I'm going to get right into it. And so since I said that I'm not going to have any honorable mentions or any extra stuff, of course, I'm immediately going to start by having two super honorable mentions. And these two super honorable mentions should not be a surprise to anyone who's been watching this channel regularly or even for a little bit. These are two comics that I absolutely believe that you can read at any point of time. Oh, wait, I had another point to make. This is why I should take notes. One point before I get started with this list is... technically speaking, I do believe that any comic can be the next comic you read after Tintin and Asterix. I don't actually think there are grades or reading levels and stepwise things as an absolute thing. I think sometimes it's helpful based on people's proclivities and leanings and likings to have something that has a greater chance of success with them. But anything that is a good comic could be an impressive thing for someone reading a comic for the first time. So I don't want to say that these are the comics that are... I mean, what I mean to say is you can go from reading Tintin and Asterix to reading Watchmen. You can. You can go to reading From Hell, or you can go to reading heavy metal. It doesn't matter, really, that gap we are talking about. But in the interests of saying, let's not have too much of a shock to the system, let's think about the comics vocabulary and what people are familiar with and what will help teach them that vocabulary, what will help get them familiar with comics by having some part anchored. That's the point of this exercise. It's not really prescriptive or a curriculum in any way. It's all in fun and, as always, an excuse to talk about comics. So that's my first major caveat out of the way. The other one is the two super honorable mentions. They're disqualified from competition. I'm not going to put them on this list because I've talked about them enough. I've made enough videos on them. And of course, they are Usagi Yojimbo and Bone. I have multiple videos on Bone and Usagi Yojimbo, two of my favorite comic series of all time, two great all ages reading, but no adult reading this will ever feel pandered to or condescended to. I mean, they can be literally for any age to enjoy. And they are both fantastically written, wonderfully drawn. They're available in black and white original as well as recolored editions. Even the older classic Usagi stories are now being reprinted in color, and the new Usagi stories being published in IDW are in color. So that means if someone has a bias, say starting out reading comics, you don't have to read them in black and white if black and white is something you're biased against. You'll get over it soon enough, or whoever you're talking about will get over it soon enough, but you don't need to force them. If they want to read color because they're familiar with color, and Asterix and Tintin Adventures, the colors are a big part of their charm, especially for young readers. Usagi Yojimbo and Bone are both available in recolored editions. In the case of Bone, I think the recolored volumes are far easier to find than the black and white editions, and there are a number of different kinds of editions of Bone and Usagi Yojimbo. Terrific comics, fantastic comics, great for all ages. Epic adventure, lots of travel, lots of new lands, lots of characters who are endearing, lots of villains. Both of these series contain all of those things that we might have been introduced to, or at least partially introduced to, through Tintin and Asterix. And at the same time, they take storytelling to the next level, where you have long form serial storytelling in the case of Bones, starting from little anecdotes and skits that becomes this, as people always compare to the Lord of the Rings, this epic fantasy about incredible consequences. And on the other hand, you have Usagi Yojimbo, which is a collection of stories. Some of them are short stories, some of them are tiny stories, some of them are longer arcs. But it's sort of a traveler on the road and the adventures they have. So when you read Usagi Yojimbo, you are now ready to read Lone Wolf and Cub, or it's the spaghetti western of the lone gunman. It's those kind of things that come through for even early age readers in a wonderful package. And so therefore, I will never not recommend Usagi Yojimbo and Bone. But having talked about them enough, having made multiple videos on them on different editions and what makes them so special, I'm leaving them out of this list, which again, like many of my lists, I'm going to try to focus on books that I may not have talked about that much on this channel, at least. So those are the two super honorable mentions out of the way. I'm getting distracted by all of the recommendations that are coming up in the chat, and I've got to keep myself focused on this. But great, great recommendations in there. So, The Adventures of Tintin, The Adventures of Asterix, have a number of different things that make them such favorites and such international favorites. I think one of the things that often gets overlooked is how global the appeal of Tintin and Asterix have been. I mean, especially for me growing up in India, these were the masterpieces of comics. There were a number of comics I read when I was young, and they were quite varied, but these stood at a different level. Perhaps helped because of their production and their nice glossy covers and their large format, very unlike any other comics we saw. And I think I've often wondered, is that did that kind of edition, which was expensive and expensive in India, did that kind of edition make it possible for it to be so popular? Because unlike, say, floppies or singles, they wouldn't get damaged as easily and they could be shipped around the world. But they're also self-contained stories, each volume for the most, except for a couple of two-parters in the case of the Tintin adventure. There's no two-parters in the Asterix adventures that I'm aware of. The standalone nature of them also made them very appealing, because you could pick up one, have a full story, then pick up another and revisit familiar characters. I don't know many people who have actually read Asterix and Tintin in order from beginning to end, at least not people my age, from my background, because it was very sporadic what you could get and how you could get it. And sometimes the stuff published, printed on the back wasn't in the right order because it was in the order it came out in English, not necessarily the chronological order. So I didn't read these two series in chronological order. So making this list, somewhere there was also in the back of my mind that if I was going to talk about a series, I would like them to have that jump in anywhere sort of approach, if not absolutely, very close to it. If you read it out of order, even if there is a chronological order, if you read them out of order, it shouldn't make that much of a difference. And you should be able to get self-contained stories as far as possible in single volumes. So that was one of the underlying things about the Tintin and Asterix series that I wanted to keep in mind. And I think when thinking about this list, the first and the most obvious choices would have to be other works by the same creators. Other works by Herge, other works by Goscinny, and other works by Uderzo. That's usually the way it works for me as an adult. When I find a book I really like, what I want is to find what else that writer has written, what else that artist has drawn. In the case of comics, what other collaborations they've had, what other collaborations they've had with other people, if they're separate people. If it's a writer-artist, I want to find out what's in their back catalog and what I can get my hands on. And that was, to a certain extent, the case when I was young, but it wasn't really easy. I mean, we didn't have the internet and the research of things. I couldn't get my hands on other stuff. I only found them sporadically. I would visit a friend and they would have a copy of a Josette and Jocko story. And I was like, oh, this looks like Tintin. It was very much like Tintin, but it wasn't Tintin. And that's how I found out something like that existed. I read one story and then I probably went for 5 or 6 years before I read another. So the first choices over here would be Josette and Jocko by Herge, the Quick and Flupke series, also by Herge. And these will give you exactly what you have seen in the Tintin comics. These will give you a very familiar art style, a very familiar color palette, and it'll be it won't really be that much of an adjustment visually speaking going from Tintin comics to something like this. Now, I haven't read much Quick and Flupke. This is the only copy I actually have sent by a very dear friend viewer of the channels who sent me a bunch of comics, and that's why I'm able to at least show this. I have never owned a copy of The Valley of the Cobras, which is the only Josette and Jocko adventure that I've ever read. But you can see, even in the back of this, that there are several books. In this, there are I think 3 or 4 books available in English from of the Josette Jocko stories, but I haven't read them. But I've read one, I've read this one, and I would say that while these will scratch that itch, they're not going to give you anything new. So another thing that I wanted to keep in mind for this list is I wanted to have a balance, a highly scientifically formulated balance between the nostalgic, the familiar, the things that are easily recognizable as things that I've seen before in Tintin and Asterix, and new things, things that I haven't seen before. So that's the way that reading has been the most wonderful for me, is when I've had a little bit of the familiar and then an unfamiliar thing that rests on my familiarity. And so therefore now a new thing becomes familiar. And that's where that range and that growth in one's reading experience really blossoms. So I wouldn't say, again, from very limited experience, I wouldn't say that these other works by Herge would necessarily give you something new. And they might, for some people, be lesser. They might not be as action-packed as the Tintin adventures. They may not have the same charm. They may not have the same appeal for a number of reasons. Maybe the situations or the circumstances are a lot more low-key. So while those would be obvious choices, they won't make my list because they're not new enough, and also because, honestly, I'm not familiar enough. Similar to that would be books that I have recently found out about, and a lot of this happened after I started this channel and I started talking about comics, and people would say, have you read European comics? Have you read this? And they started giving me a lot of recommendations for a lot of people that I had never heard of, or if I had heard of, I had never read anything by. When that happened, I found that it wasn't really very easy for me to get my hands on a lot of these books that were being recommended to me. A lot of them weren't available in English, and if they were very hard to find editions from a long time ago. And then there were some that were being reprinted and available cheaply, and it was easier to get some than others. So thinking about that, I did want to wonder, when I make this list and I want to say, here are 10 comics to go out and read, would it be fair for me to list things that are hard to get your hands on? Because if I want to make a recommendation, I would like it if people can go out and read those. So therefore, I'm also going to probably see if something is really tough to get. I can't make it a recommendation the same way I can make something else a recommendation, because what's the point of recommending something if it's not available or if it's not accessible? Similar to what we talked about over here is Spirou. And this is something that I've only recently become, I would say in the last couple of years, I've become familiar with. And again, thanks to first of all, people on YouTube and comments and recommendations, and then again to someone who sent me these comics, these editions that are available here in India. And you can see again, something about the art style will be familiar, something about the color palette will be familiar, the structure of these stories, the lightheartedness of them might immediately strike you as something that you can anchor to what you've read in Tintin and Asterix. So the Adventures of Spirou and Fantasio, and there are a lot of them. I think I have now gotten about 15 of them, and they have a variety of writers and artists. So there have been changes in the stories. But again, it feels, except for a couple of stories which feature the introduction of key characters, they can be read in any order. I mean, of course, there's a chronology within the world. And this, again, makes for something very pleasing, very pleasant, and familiar. Now, the only thing that I had with Spirou is I wasn't able to feel, maybe because I didn't read it at a young age and I was able to appreciate the art and design, but I wasn't able to feel the same charm from the stories that I had when I read Tintin and Asterix. And of course, this is not about an outright judgment on the works themselves. It's about who I am, how old I was when I read that. And now I'm wondering if this is something that would have had a lot more appeal for me when I was younger. So I definitely want to recommend this, particularly because these editions do seem to be easier to find than, say, the Josette and Jocko books that I mentioned. And people's experience with these stories might be different. There are art style adjustments and changes that I think will make for a natural evolution from something like Linclair or something like the more cartoony forms of Asterix and Tintin. I thought about Mort Walker and Blondie and Dagwood, a lot of that kind of drawing, and it's a question of becoming familiar with different styles. So this definitely adds that dimension of those different styles. Now that you've seen Tintin, you've seen Asterix, slightly different, but also along the same lines would be the reason to recommend Spirou. And of course, similarly, it would be the case with The Adventures of Blake and Mortimer by Edgar P. Jacobs. So just the way that you could read more stuff by Herge or Goscinny and Uderzo, you could also read other stuff done by people who collaborated with Herge in studios, Herge, Edgar P. Jacobs being one of them. And there are a number of books done by the people who are actually more responsible for a certain Tintin look than I knew. I thought it was all one person writing and drawing everything, and it was only much, much later in life that I found out about the collaborative nature of making the Tintin stories. So following the writers and artists who were involved in Tintin on their own works will give you definitely a hint. This is much more realistic, much less cartoony than something like Spirou and Asterix, more in line with the Tintin drawings. And these stories are also more scientifically grounded. And I mean, I say that with a pinch of salt because they are sci-fi and a bit outlandish, but not total fantasy. And there's a lot of rigor in explaining cause and effect and how, and this includes the mysteries and how did somebody get in and how did they get somewhere else. Very Agatha Christie-like in its explicitness, in its exposition, which can be right up your alley and give you exactly what you're looking for as a hit from what you miss about, Tintin now that you've finished everything. But it could also be a deterrent. For some people, the amount of text in some Tintin comics is a lot. And I can understand that, especially when you've got this whole page of Tintin right at the bottom, sitting with Captain Haddock, and a bottle, and the whole thing is a story that Captain Haddock is saying, or it's a whole thing is a conversation with these huge blocks of text and small figures at the bottom. And some people find that tiring and trying, in which case I think the Adventures of Blake and Mortimer will be even worse. There's a lot of text in this, and that's one of the most common critiques I've heard of it, of people who don't enjoy this as much as other people do. But if you're not bothered by reading text in comics, this could be just what you're looking for, as I said, to give you that fix that you're craving. And there are a number of books that are the Blake and Mortimer Adventures. They were originally done by Edgar P. Jacobs, but again, like a couple of these other series, they've been taken up and continued by other creators, some of which are more updated and modern sensibilities are included. Now, with all of these European comics that I'm talking about, the Franco-Belgian comics I'm talking about, the time in which they were published makes a significant difference. It makes a difference to not just the depictions and the attitudes of the characters, some of which is just taken for granted, that this is the way everyone thinks and this is what everyone feels, but also the commentary that you may or may not have on the world. Whether it's about war, whether it's about capitalism, whether it's about the United States, whether it's about colonialism, these kind of things will be a product of their time. So that may or may not be interesting to people, or it may be a barrier to someone young, for example, reading them today, whereas an adult picking them up might be able to contextualize it all for themselves or through research that may not work that much as an all ages reading. So as charming as these works are, and as historically significant and as artistically interesting as they are, they may not always work today for today's readers looking for the next thing after Tintin and Asterix. And that's also because, again, if you read Tintin and Asterix when you were young and you're older now and you want to read something along the same lines, you may not be able to put yourself back into the mind space of your young self to approach all of the writing and all of the presentation of the story in the same way. So those are things to keep in mind, and things that I've got in mind when I wonder about these being the next recommendation, which is, again, why, although they would, again, work perfectly, I wouldn't make them my immediate recommendations of comics to read following Tintin and Asterix. And the same thing will apply for something like Izhnogoud, which is by Tabari, but Goscinny of the Asterix comics was involved in these stories. And this is a much more cartoony comic than, say, Blake and Mortimer. Much closer to the Asterix depiction. It has an exotic land and a vizier who is trying to overthrow or sneakily dispose of the caliph so he can become the caliph himself. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of slapstick, but there might be things in it that are not politically correct, that will not work for today's audiences. There might be depictions of peoples and cultures in a particular way that, although light-hearted in its approach, will feel not quite as harmless if you have a particular reading of it. Izhnogoud is one of those series that is available easily, apparently, over here. And I have a whole bunch of adventures, and I've read a number of these adventures. And I wouldn't say that they've blown me away, but I wouldn't say that they've really angered, or I wouldn't have as many of them if I had been, angered or irritated by them. They're more of one thing, and they don't bring anything new to the table. They are interesting artifacts, and it's always interesting to know what different people were working on and what kind of things were being made. And really, this is a question of availability. A lot of these books, as I said, are not easily available, but the ones that are, you can pick up for a fairly reasonable price, at least here in India, and take a look and see if they're to your tastes. So those are the ones that, would be natural sort of thinking about this. And I saw in the comments, people have mentioned a couple of series that I've never gotten to read, but I know from recommendations that these are other series that people who worked on Asterix, that people who worked in Studios Herge have been involved in and worked on. I haven't read any of those, so I can't recommend one way or the other. What I have found is that because of the variety, and this is, I said there won't be any honorable mentions and things like that, but this is the only category, it's only the first beginning part of it that I'm going to do this for. And that's because European comics, it's just too broad a label anyway. And even if you talk about a particular Franco-Belgian clear line school or a particular grouping, it's still an entire universe out there. We're talking about a continent, and there are other comics that aren't Franco-Belgian comics, but all of them can be approached, at least partially, by reading works like this and getting to see what else is out there, what else is familiar. All of these work as stepping stones. And what I've seen recently, this is about things being available in English. I've seen a couple of books being brought out by publishers like Fantagraphics, who brought out 10,000 Years in Hell, which is a Gil Jordan adventure by Maurice Tilliou. And once again, for people familiar with Tintin, Asterix, other comics, this will look similar. This will look like it's got that feel to it, the comedy in it, the physical depictions of people, even things like the lettering and the punctuation. These will be familiar enough for you to get into a new series of adventures featuring a new character without thinking, without being too alienated or without finding yourself too out of your depth. And and it's great that Fantagraphics would bring this out in English. I haven't seen any other Tilliou books from Fantagraphics, or maybe I've just missed them. This is a little bit more serious, and especially more serious than this cover lets on. It's a little bit more politically aware, and I mean, it has, I wouldn't say an agenda, but it definitely has an authorial vision and intent behind the storytelling that has to do with politics and that has to do with authority and things like that. And it's an interesting combination for me to see that with this kind of art style, which probably because of my own prejudices would make me think about it being purely slapstick and purely, comic in a silly way, which it isn't. So if there were more of these, if I could get my hands on more of them, I would love to read them. I also read this, as a recommendation from one of the viewers, I read The Blue Coats, only one volume, and that was also very interesting. Similar art style, similar, when I say similar, I don't mean to say that they're the same. I just mean that they're familiar enough and they relate enough to what we've seen with the Tintin and Asterix adventures for it to feel familiar to us, even if we haven't seen this exact same thing. A lot of these things, a lot of these books, the availability is a question, and The Blue Coats was one of those things. It's set, of all places, in the U.S. Civil War, during the U.S. Civil War, and it's a Franco-Belgian comic with this kind of artwork, and I just couldn't find the copy before this live stream. But I would love to read more Blue Coats because it seemed so unusual a setting, and then the artwork and the layouts worked for me. So that's another one of those series that I could think of as easily being a stepping stone from here. Oh, it's got weird. We got some sort of a spammer here. I'm not really sure on... Oh dear. I'm on some sort of other control, I think, or something. 1 second. People are typing too fast. Oh, I just deleted a message instead of... All right. I don't know. I hope I got rid of that. The Blue Coats is a good one to pick up. Sorry about the interruption, everyone. But I will... Oh, look, I've got the wrong things coming up. Now the chat comes up on the screen when I'm trying to click on a spammer and get rid of them. Because of course that's the way it would work, but I'm glad to see that this is working. There we go. Yes, indeed. All right. Very good. Sorry for the interruption, but yes, and again, I'm just scratching the surface over here because there's so much I don't know about, and that's why, as I was saying, check out the comments, check out the chat, because there are things over there that are just along the lines of this. And another thing that I've found, and these are, I think, more recent books by Dodier, Mako, and Letendre, which is the Jerome Bloch stories. These are being brought out by IDW and the Eurocomics, their Eurocomics imprint. And once again, it's all about finding what else there is that looks a particular way, that feels a particular way, but then when you read it, it's a different kind of story. It's a different kind of adventure. It's a different kind of setting. So these are all things that I think could be great things to jump on as far as let's read more European comics. Especially, I think, when I was young, Tintin and Asterix were the only real European comics I got to read because they were the only ones available. Of course, as I mentioned, there were a couple that showed up in other places. So my introduction to more European comics came much later in life, and through very different looking things. But it's not hard to imagine going from here to reading something like this as a youngster, reading something like this as a teenager or more grown up, and then moving on to things like Adele Blanc by Jacques Tardy, from which you could go and read other Jacques Tardy, but start with the fantasy, steampunk, silly, farcical stuff that would line up with this, as well as what's coming afterwards. And I've talked about Adele Blanc in a couple of different videos now, particularly my Jacques Tardy video. And I can just see this as being the thing in between this pile of comics and the other pile of comics that come up later. And of course, then you can read heavy metal or metal, hold on, and get to, this is stuck, and get to things like Incal, where you can see Mobius and Mobius artwork and try to, I think you can still have your mind blown by this artwork and also find things familiar. I think more about the line work and the colors, the sort of flatness of the colors. I think the lack of gradients is one of the things that, when I was young, was very remarkable and different. They look different from American comics. They look different from other comics that I was reading at the time, and I can see all of these sort of coming together in a big wave. But at this point of time, you could say that, all right, so you've got all of these things and you wouldn't put all of these on the list. What would you put? And I think from the point of view of accessibility and availability and enjoyment, I'd go with 2. So the first of my 10 comics, of the first 2, would probably be Lucky Luke and the Smurfs. Because, first of all, I don't think Lucky Luke or the Smurfs age as much as some of these other comics that I've looked at. I don't think they date themselves as badly, although there are a couple of things. But they're also incredibly charming. They're fully formed, and they make, for the same reasons as the Tintin and the Asterix adventures, they make for great things to read one book at a time. You can have a collection of stories, or you can have a full adventure. Lucky Luke is set in the Wild Wild West and is a cowboy. So that's terrific. Anyway, he can shoot faster than his shadow. So he is a badass cowboy. He's a loner, sort of wanders the prairie, goes from town to town. Very classic tropes of the Western. He has a horse, his constant companion, but he also knows how to have fun and he knows how to party. So he's kind of a laconic adventurer, like, the Clint Eastwood type, but you also have the kind of adventurer that Asterix is, or the kind of adventurer that Tintin is. You've got a moral center in Lucky Luke. You've got him standing up for the underdog, the way that you have Tintin and Asterix and Obelix doing. Enough things that are familiar as far as your hero, as far as travels, as far as the strange setting, as far as the period thing is concerned, with enough new things about the cowboy and the western, and making references to so many things in the West. Like, there's a lot of Latin and a lot of stuff about ancient Rome that I probably didn't get in Asterix, and I probably learned from Asterix. So I can think of Lucky Luke as something that can do for the Wild West what Asterix did for ancient Rome and ancient Gaul, at least for a child, but also for an adult. I think they're just wonderful reads, and I was very excited to see there's a new Lucky Luke version that's out in French. I think it's coming out in English, which is a modern, updated, like a sort of darker, I don't know if it's grittier, but it looks like a more serious type of vision of Lucky Luke, and I'm going to be very, very interested in seeing how that turns out. And on the other side, I have the Smurfs, which I read when I was young. This is actually one of my childhood copies. People may be familiar, this is very yellowed, but people may be familiar with the cartoon, and I guess there have been a couple of movies. I haven't seen any of the movies, but the Smurfs is a terrific comic. It is funny, it's charming, it's got a village of, it's a small village of these people. It's got Papa Smurf is the wizard, Getafix brewing potions. There's enough over there, again, that's familiar to us. It's very similar to Asterix from that small community and all of the people in the community that you get to know over the variety of stories. You've got this one evil Gargamel and his cat. It's not something you haven't seen before, but it's done with such charm and it's done with such effervescent fun, and the artwork is wonderful. It's squashy and rounded. It's not the realistic sharp edges of certain other things that we've seen before. Everything looks like it's made out of mushrooms. I mean, their huts are mushrooms, but all of it, their caps and the bottles and the backpacks that they have, everything has got this curvature that just makes it look like perfect little plush toys. It's beautifully done, and these are all good-natured stories. There's no viciousness, there's no meanness, there's no cruelty. I mean, apart from the sort of cartoony villainy that you have, and the stories are still interesting. Again, I think the Smurfs is easily available. I'm not sure. Paper Cuts in the United States had brought these editions out, but I know that Smurfs has been very popular and always been around. So that's another reason why I would say that of all the stack of the Franco-Belgian European comics that I was thinking of as the next step from Asterix and Tintin, the two that I would start with would be Lucky Luke and the Smurfs. Just from my experience and from my opinion, of course, any one of these, just like any other comic, could easily be the next one. But those are the two that I would pick. Okay. Yeah, let's see. Do I get to? Yeah. So Arsis says that the value of the Smurfs comics is sometimes underrated due to the huge success of the animation. I wouldn't be surprised. I think when you have a movie or a cartoon or a video game, I don't know, when you have something that is very, very successful, that tends to be how people think of things. So the most famous, I think, case that everyone talks about is the Adam West Batman, and everyone thought of Batman as the way that show depicted it. And that certainly happened for a lot of things that haven't been well translated and frustrated fans, where they're just like, that's not it, this is what it is. I don't know much about the Smurfs cartoons. I don't think I've watched any of the Smurfs cartoons, or maybe I watched one, but I don't think they're that off. I think a lot of them are based on these particular comics, but the comics really are very charming, very wonderful. They've got a very strong sense of place and situation and the characters bouncing off of each other and the artwork. It's the world, the way that the forests outside the Gaulish village, or the forest between them and the Roman camps, the way that was a real forest, the forest of the Smurfs, seems like a real forest to me. So it's good achievement in comics, creating that sort of place, creating that sort of atmosphere. If you like the new take on Lucky Luke, I haven't read the new take on Lucky Luke. I'll have to take a look and then see what happens. Yeah, and who says that the cartoon doesn't detract too much from the Smurfs comics? That's the impression I got as well. Pretty faithful. Like, here's the thing. I'd never seen any Tintin cartoons. I'd never seen the animated Tintin, which apparently even ran on HBO in the United States. And a lot of American viewers of this channel have told me that that's where they first got to know about Tintin. And I've seen, I think, a couple of those. And they're not bad because they're very faithful to the comics. It's almost panel by panel, scene by scene. But because it's an animation, the pacing is different than the pacing in your head as a comic. And a 2-page layout is something else, and something happening on screen for the equal amount of time that it took up on page, it becomes too equal on screen. Every moment is one moment. Every second is 1 second. So I think in spite of being faithful to the comics, the Tintin cartoons, to me, maybe I watched them too late in life, they were very faithful and I was very happy. They didn't change the material. They didn't insult the material. They were, that's a good adaptation from that point of view. Nothing sacrilegious happened, but it wasn't the same. So I wonder if it's that way with the Smurfs, or maybe the Smurfs cartoons just got the pacing right and got the timing right, because the comics are really great. So the comics, I think, have as I said, not anything groundbreaking, but not anything insulting and not anything that'll make you roll your eyes. I've read a lot of young readers' fiction and children's books that really irritate me because they feel to me very insulting. But the Smurfs do not, and Lucky Luke definitely does not. So here we are, 1 hour down, 2 comics down, but a whole bunch of the honorable mentions and the big stack of stuff that was going to be all the qualifiers, that's done. The 2 super honorable mentions, that's done. Number 1 and 2, they're done. So now we can move on to number 3. And I think number 3 is very easily guessable, not just for people who know me and this channel, but just as a natural thing. I think I even saw it in the chat. The third comic that I would recommend, and I'm going to cheat over here again, of course, is Uncle Scrooge. And I'm going to cheat by saying Uncle Scrooge by Karl Barks, Uncle Scrooge by Don Rosa. It doesn't matter. Pick one, pick both, and read them all. Uncle Scrooge is terrific comics. And talk about something, because I think, again, the fact that Uncle Scrooge comics are something maybe after the 80s or after DuckTales, maybe that thing got subsumed somehow, as in DuckTales as a TV show is what people knew, and it had the song, and it was a good show. It was a fun show. The comics are fantastic comics. Now, with Karl Barks, who did Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck and a bunch of other Disney comics for many, many years, there's a huge catalog of his work on both Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck. He actually has more Donald Duck stories than he has Uncle Scrooge stories, I think. But once Fantagraphics gets done printing all of these, publishing all of the Karl Barks library, which they do 2 volumes in a year, I think there are going to be 35 volumes total of his stories. So there's a lot out there. And don't worry about it. Pick up anything. You don't have to read them chronologically. Just pick up whatever you can find. If you want to give someone a gift, give them any one of these volumes. Give them more than one. You won't regret it. these are beautifully reproduced. Some of the issues with some of these European comics reprints, people have told me, is they don't like the printing quality, they don't like the colors, they don't like the color reproduction, and the translation. Nobody will say that about Fantagraphics' Uncle Scrooge editions. This is the way remastering color or reproducing original color should be, in my absolutely uninformed opinion. They're beautiful to look at. They do the stories justice. And Uncle Scrooge is a terrific character who you get to see evolve. He doesn't start off as the lovable Uncle Scrooge we may know. And because Karl Barks has so many Uncle Scrooge stories, there will be some that will not be as great as some others, but they're all different. There are some that are just one-page gags. There are some that are these long adventure stories that really... people always point out in my Tintin video, my very early What is Tintin video, I made the mistake of saying Steven Spielberg was influenced by Tintin, when he made Indiana Jones. And people are like, no, he wasn't. He'd never heard of Tintin. It was Karl Barks that he was influenced by, and George Lucas were influenced by. It was Uncle Scrooge, not Tintin. The sense of adventure, of going across the world, of finding treasure, of finding temples, of finding different cultures. It's everything that you enjoyed about things like The Prisoners of the Sun is there in Uncle Scrooge over and over again. There's also stuff that is here in Duckburg and here with the Beagle Boys, the kind of things that we might be familiar with there's encounters with aliens, and there's lost cities. The whole scope of the adventures that Uncle Scrooge can have is what makes this series of comics so good. And you can have a great time with him going fishing with his nephews and trying to catch the big fish in the lake, and another one in which they're building a rocket to go to the moon. They can all coexist in the same universe. That's part of the genius of that. But there's a lot out there, and there's a lot to read of Karl Barks' Uncle Scrooge. So just get your hands on whatever you want to, and you won't go wrong. With the Don Rosa books, it's a little different, because I think Don Rosa only worked for about 10 years on Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck. And so it's a lot more intense, it's a lot more focused, and I'm not sure about it, but there are 10 volumes, also from Fantagraphics, that collect the entirety of Don Rosa. And whereas there is some variation, I mean, there's no doubt that Karl Barks' Uncle Scrooge is the basis for Don Rosa's Uncle Scrooge. Don Rosa is very much basing his work on Karl Barks' work, sort of ignoring anyone else who did Uncle Scrooge between them, or anyone else who did any other Uncle Scrooge stories. He's very much a successor intentionally, but his output is a lot more intense, and it has a greater hit rate, in my opinion. No disrespect to Karl Barks, of course, because Karl Barks has worked but he worked with a bunch of different situations and different kinds of pressures. He had to do different kinds of stories. Don Rosa seems to have been much more focused, and therefore, when you pick up the 10 volumes of Don Rosa, you're just going to get all filler, all killer, no filler, as the saying goes. Everything that Don Rosa has done is magnificent. But whether you pick up so I'll show you a little bit on how updated and slick some of this will look, but how unmistakably the same thing it is as what we saw before. And it's really the storytelling and the adventures. A lot is made of the life and times of Scrooge McDuck, the 12 issues that is celebrated as Don Rosa's pièce de résistance, and with very good reason, but everything else is also very good. So I would say that either Karl Barks or Don Rosa would be great, but the best would be both Don Rosa and both Don Rosa and Karl Barks. Very worthy to be read together, and an absolutely natural progression from having read the sort of traveling adventures and the cross-cultural exploits of Tintin and Asterix. All right. Oh, I'm not getting the full comment up on screen, but Weird Proc says it caught me off guard how mean Scrooge can be in the comics versus the DuckTales cartoons. Yeah, and especially at the beginning. Scrooge wasn't really meant to be a hero, I think, at the beginning. He was more of a foil and a person messing things up for our heroes, but he was just so endearing, or he ended up becoming so endearing that he did end up becoming a hero. And of course, the new DuckTales comics cartoons have play with that aspect of it as well. But the comics are really fantastic. So that is number 1, number 2, and number 3. Next up, number 4. I believe I would have seen this as well. The next recommendation I have for continuing from Tintin and Asterix is Gru by Sergio Aragonés. Gru is fantastic comics, very accessible, very enjoyable. You would think that the formula of this buffoon Conan spoof done in Sergio Aragonés' inimitable style, Mad Magazine for a lot of people is this style, or very much a big part of Mad Magazine's atmosphere comes from this style. And Gru is a terrific comic book. It is a comedy. It is absolutely silly. It's ridiculous. It contains fantasy. It contains magic. It contains lots and lots of fighting, a lot of death. I think I read somewhere that Gru is the most murderous or the bloodiest comics character of all time. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's Conan, but I think Gru's right up there. Miyamoto Usagi, I think, is somewhere there as well, but nowhere near as Gru. And the thing is, at first I was like, okay, it's a spoof of Conan. It's a spoofy kind of thing. All right, the guy is pretty brainless. The joke is that he's an excellent fighter. He's unbeatable in battle, but he is unlike Miyamoto Usagi from Usagi Yojimbo, who is wise and considered, and this guy is just an idiot. He's an absolute goofball, and he always leaves places worse than he found them. So the recurring thing is he comes into town and the whole thing is destroyed by the time he's leaving town. Whatever was there, he has made things worse. Sometimes he stumbles upon doing the right thing somehow. Sometimes he ends up being rewarded in some manner. But most of the times, no. And you've got a whole bunch of his adventures, and you've got Gru published by, I think, a number of different publishers over the years, and then they'll put them out in trade paperbacks like this. And that's another thing, is that there will be characters you've met before. There will be characters you have encountered before that will show up again later on in the stories. But the vast majority of them, even with those characters, can just be read in any order you want. I mean, pick up a trade if you're getting one of the mini series of 4 issues or 5 issues. Pick up any book of Gru's, and I think you'll have a really good time. And I also think there's something magnificent in the way it's kind of like Crazy Cat, the comic by George Herman, where it's difficult for me to understand how the same thing happening over and over again can keep being fresh, can keep being new. How much can you actually get out of one formula? And Crazy Cat and Gru, I think, are the 2 supreme examples for me that you can do a lot with this one simple formula. If you're good enough at what you're doing, if you can see the story and if you can see the characters clearly enough, you can do it forever and still be fresh. And that's very, very rare. Gru also has a dog, like Tintin does, like Obelix does. His dog has sarcastic commentary on the things that are going on, but he doesn't directly communicate with Gru. So there are other things apart from this period, fantasy, magic thing that do connect to Tintin and Asterix in those ways. Those elements are familiar, but really it's the sense of fun and the sense of lunacy taken to ridiculous levels, taken to absolute chaos levels, that makes Gru such a natural progression for me from reading Tintin and Asterix. If you haven't read Gru yourself, I think you should check out at least a couple of stories. It's hard for me to describe it because I don't want to say it's earth-shattering philosophy, but there's something marvelous in its formula and the way that it, as I said, keeps mining that formula for laughs and inevitable results. Even though you know what's coming, you're waiting to see it come about, and that relationship with the reader, I think, is what makes Gru so special. All right, I'm going to make a little bit of noise, but not too bad. All right. Okay, so that is number 4, Gru. Now, another thing that I did mention this at the top of the live stream, that I will be leaning towards that all ages type of reading. I think that's just a natural thing because we're talking about after Tintin and Asterix. But there is also an aspect of saying, I read Tintin and Asterix when I was young. What would I like as an adult now that I read adult stuff? And maybe one of the lists that I'll make in the future, I'll focus completely on adults. But this list over here is going to get slightly more and more grown up as we go along. So I don't mean it's going to become something that is only 18 plus, although no, I don't think so, but we'll see. But it is interesting to me that what a 9-year-old will like and what a 15-year-old will like may not be the same thing, and what a 12-year-old will like and what a 17-year-old will like may not be the same thing. And so definitely for 24, 35. At the same time, because of that focus on all ages, I did want to find works that can appeal to children and adults in different ways while being the same thing. Kind of the way that people used to talk about Pixar movies is that there's this level for kids and there's this other level for adults, and both of them can coexist at the same time, which I think all of the comics that we've done, that we've talked about, do to a certain extent. But even with, say, something like Don Rosa, you're not actually looking at two different levels. You're looking at the same level and enjoying it. You might like a particular piece of artistry or a piece of choreography a bit more than some kid who is not able to appreciate that yet, but you're not really laughing at two different jokes. There isn't really a double entendre that someone's not getting. Either the kid didn't get it or you don't think it's funny as an adult. It's not going to go in two different directions necessarily. I think Avatar: The Last Airbender in comics, very similar to the way the animated show was, is one of those things that can do it at a couple of different levels at the same time. By this, I don't mean that there are puns or jokes. I think this makes my list because it is incredibly accessible. It is terrifically drawn and designed and laid out from the art and the colors. The storytelling is impeccable. The characters, the dialogue, the writing is superb. And it ends up being quite serious and it ends up being quite mature. And being a book, you say, okay, this is for kids who liked the Nickelodeon TV show, and it's a continuation. It's a continuation of the TV show. So it's not a rehash of what you've seen. It's not a comics version of what the TV show already had. It's what happens after the TV show ends. And it's superb. It's really mature in a way that even the TV show, I think, wasn't. And I love the TV show. I don't think you need to have watched the TV show to read the comics, but I think it helps. I think it will definitely give you a background into who these people are. But if you start reading the books, you'll get that background soon enough yourself. It is difficult if you're coming from another medium and you're a fan of something in another medium. It is difficult to see it in comics because sometimes I think they miss what made something great, and it's just IP, etc., which was my first worry about comic books on Avatar. But the fact that it is not just the creators of the TV show and the writers of the TV show, but Jean Luen Yang, who's doing the writing of this, whose work in comics I have really loved over the years, and who's done fantastic work with identity and race and culture and these kind of things that Avatar seemed to have under its surface, the questions of warring nations. And the books, I think, are a growth. So if you were 9 years old or 10 years old when you watched the show and loved it, and now you're 15 or 16, this book sort of has grown with that audience. And the stories over here, the war is over. So the TV show ended and there was a war, and that war has now finally ended and peace has come to the land. And for example, the first story is about the complications with peace and what to do about resettlement, and what do you do with the colonies, and what about people who have been born in the colonies? Do they belong? Which country do they belong to? Amazing stuff for a kid's comic. Once again, high adventure, great characters, witty banter. You can pick up any one of these books really and get a sense of a very rich world in a way that I don't think gets enough credit. So whether you're a fan of the TV show or not, this is not just a simple tie-in, merchandising, cash grab sort of thing. This is very good storytelling that focuses on the kind of things that I think are there in Asterix and Tintin as well, about countries and borders and how people react with each other and what they're angry about and how easily war can break out and how do you broker peace. There are a lot of these things that are sort of underneath what looks like a little adventure. And a story like this, I think, is an obvious continuation of those kind of themes. So that would be my number 5 pick, Avatar: The Last Airbender. There are a whole bunch of them written by Jean Luen Yang, and then new ones written by Faith Erin Hicks. So again, you've got good people, and of course Guru Hiru doing the art over on the Jean Luen Yang stories. So you've got terrific teams working on these stories that I really think everyone should give a look to and not dismiss the way that I almost did, thinking that it's just a way of making money. Very, very good storytelling. Okay, let's see. Number 6. Now, one thing that I haven't talked about is the fact that Asterix and Obelix, and to a certain extent Tintin, were to me also the first superheroes that I knew of. Asterix and Obelix because of the magic potion, so they've got superpowers, but it's been said that you don't need to have superpowers to be a superhero. Tintin is a superhero. Tintin is a superhero because he, by himself, stops wars. He gets amazing things done. The superhero is evaluated through the results and the significance of what they're able to achieve, not necessarily their powers. So in that way, even though I did read, as a child, I did read Superman and Batman and Spider-Man and those things, and they came a little later, this fantastical ability, because I think when I started reading Tintin, I was like, Tintin is a boy reporter. And I think they did away with that after a while, but He's a boy reporter. How does a boy become a reporter? So first of all, that was incredibly appealing to a young boy. And then he's wandering all over the world and he's buying tickets and checking into ships and hotels and stuff like that. And you're like, surely he's not a kid. And I think later on you get the idea that he's not an absolute kid, but it was his confidence. He just signs on to be a radio operator on a ship and stuff like that. It was his confidence that made him a superhero. And then he would just interrogate people and he would just ask people, and he'd be in the palace of the king and he'd be dining with these people, and it was incredible. So I've always thought of Asterix and Tintin as superheroes because of what they achieved. They're going up against empires, they're going up against armies and things like that. So when I was thinking about what would be the superhero story that I would say would make a good transition, supposing someone has only read Tintin and Asterix and they want to read superheroes. Now, it's easy. I could say, well, let's pick something like The Spirit or something more obscure or something more shadowy or less. But I wanted to pick a superhero, and then I realized that actually the most obvious choice for me was Ultimate Spider-Man, because Ultimate Spider-Man is a very accessible superhero comic, and it makes for a great bridge between this and that before you get into everything about the superhero continuities and the world and things like that. This, I think, was a reset. I'm not very familiar with the machinations of DC and Marvel. I don't know if the Ultimate Universe still exists or it become a parallel universe or it never existed. But this was just starting the Spider-Man story from the beginning, happening in the 90s instead of back in the 60s. It's just an update of Spider-Man, but it was done so well and it was so fresh and it felt like something familiar had been given such an interesting new form, because it was adapting what had come before it to a modern style, but not really talking down to modern audiences. It's really not pandering. That's the thing I'm always worried about, is that level of condescension. And this was smart. This was funny. It had like that whiplash banter that some people don't like Bendis's writing, but I think it worked really well over here. And I think if we think about the time that this was published, this fits right into a certain kind of high school depiction, whether it's in movies or TV shows, popular culture, and does that Spider-Man mythos, does that Spider-Man storytelling in it, in my opinion, as well as I've ever seen it done. Better than the movies, for example, for sure. Better than many of the TV shows that I've seen. But again, I don't have a lot in comics. I haven't been reading Spider-Man all my life. I read a lot of Spider-Man when I was a kid, but that was about whatever was available to me. So I wasn't necessarily reading in continuity. I got to read Ultimate Spider-Man in continuity. I got to read it one after the other, and it was fantastic. But the reason I pick it for this list is there are a number of, like, if I decided to make a top 10 gateway superhero comics list, there would probably be a number of titles that I would put in there. I probably put Ultimate Spider-Man in there as well, but there could be so many other titles, but none of them felt like it would have the kind of storytelling that this has, as far as this age-old, power and responsibility and what do you do as a kid. That idea of that coming of age, being married to the coming of these powers and puberty, it's nothing new, but the way that it is done over here felt fresh. It felt exciting. It felt interesting, and it felt real. Not real as in a documentary, in a high school sort of real, but the way that the teenage life and the superhero life is put together, I thought was very well done. So when thinking about moving from standalone stories like we have in Tintin and Asterix and in a number of these, when moving from these self-contained stories to longer arcs, longer epic things, even if we have something like Gru or Usagi Yojimbo, which I disqualified, even if we have these long-running series, they're sort of closing the loop on each other. on each story as a standalone read, and it's not necessarily one long arc. And that's the way most comic books, superhero comic books, start out, and then they become more and more convoluted. And I don't mean that in a necessarily bad way, but that's one of the powers that they have, that they're able to create their own mythology. So as a stepping stone from things where the mythology is pieced together by you because of the world you saw in separate stories, and now you're putting it together where the mythology just starts bleeding a little bit more, the continuity comes in a bit more. I don't think I've seen it better done than Ultimate Spider-Man, especially for someone who's not familiar with comics and who's getting into reading maybe longer superhero comics series for the first time. This one gives you a great lead character that you can root for. It surrounds that lead character with other characters that you care for. If something bad happens to them, it's Spider-Man, so you know something bad happens to them. You care about it, even if you know what's coming. You want to see how it's done in this new adaptation. If you have no idea how things are coming, they look amazing and interesting. All of those are reasons why I would put Ultimate Spider-Man on my list of 10 comics, on this particular list of 10 comics to read after Tintin and Asterix. Okay, so that's 6 comics down. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 comics left. And the next comics that I'm going to talk about are probably the least known comics on this list. Either this is the least known, or this one and the one after that. Gore Vidal says Ultimate Spider-Man is a well-regarded Spider-Man run. Good. I'm glad to hear it. I was, because I'm not in touch, I wasn't sure how it stands, as far as fans or readership is concerned. But I thought it was, I liked it. I thought that's the way superhero comics should be, at least one part of them. And definitely as a reset, or definitely as a new point to start, it's one of those things that works really well as a recommendation, and has worked really well as a recommendation for me to give to other people who are looking for stuff to read. Tommy says it's hooch he's got in this mug. In this mug? Yeah, it's like Everclear. That's what I'm drinking. All right, so the next comic that I would like to talk about, number 7 on this list, is the Delilah Dirk comics by Tony Cliff. There are 3 of these books. The first one is Delilah Dirk and the Turkish Lieutenant. The second book is Delilah Dirk and the King's Shilling. And the third is Delilah Dirk and the Pillars of Hercules. Now, I know that most people I talk to haven't heard of Delilah Dirk. These 3 books are published by First Second, a great publisher I talk about quite often. But I also gather that it's quite successful. In fact, I believe Delilah Dirk, the first one, The Turkish Lieutenant, was a self-published comic, and then First Second picked it up. I could be wrong about that. But this is an adventure, a swashbuckling adventure, period piece, set, here is where she meets the Turkish Lieutenant, set in a part of the world that we don't see a lot of comics about, and featuring a lead female character who is hot-headed and brash. She's like a rich kid, but she's also a runaway from home and picked up street smarts. And her companion, Selim, who is a much gentler, more civilized. He's the Turkish lieutenant. His expertise is in making tea. And the dynamic between the two of them is it's one of the best friendships I've seen in comics. The way that they work together. The first story in which they encounter each other and sparks fly, but not romantic sparks. And that's, I think, an important part of the story as well. Although they kind of have like some fun references to that. But this is, first and foremost, as I said, a swashbuckling adventure. It is swords and jumping out of windows and sword fighting and espionage and spy thrills oceans, rivers, anything that when you think of these sort of Western European historical fantasies, you've got a particular vibe when you think about architecture and the kind of armor they wear. Now you take that into Central Asia, the Middle East, and suddenly things are very different looking, and not necessarily in the way that they would be presented in Disney movies like Aladdin. But much more authentically for the time and place, without losing a sense of fantasy adventure. So you've got uniforms, you've got soldiers, you've got weapons that seem very real and true to history, and you've got stories of colonialism and but at the same time you also have horse riding, spear fighting. It's great adventure storytelling, made as entertaining as it is because of the characters involved. These three, I think, are the only Delilah Dirk books. I would be very happy to see more, but once again, just in one read, and the first book is quite slim, the second book is the thickest one. These are great stories. There were a number of stories from first, second that almost made this list because they are a very good all ages publisher, and they've got things for young adult readers that doesn't seem like young adult the way that marketing makes it, where you'll have a sense of adventure and you'll have a sense of danger, but you don't necessarily need to be grimy and gritty and mean about it. As I said before, all of these books, I think, are very open-hearted books. They're very... Even if they have things like death, it doesn't seem exploitative. It doesn't seem like manipulation, and it doesn't seem cheap. It seems earned. But none of these books really seem interested in focusing on the nastiest, yuckiest parts of life. They're all books that have a sense of hope and this idea of heroism where I can change the world. This person can make this, prevent this from happening. They can bring justice to those things. Those are the kind of things that we liked seeing in the Tintin and Asterix comics. We want the bullies to get their comeuppance. And that's the kind of stuff that I think these stories are very good at. That's another reason why Ultimate Spider-Man makes the list, is how people are standing up to bullies and what the pushback is against powers that could be out of our control if we just wanted them to be, but the hero takes up the mantle. To do those kind of things in the historical context, to do those kind of things in the fantasy context, are always going to be interesting to me. And I think these stories, the Delilah Dirk comics by Tony Cliff, do them terrifically. If I have another such list, I will bring up a couple of other series that came very close to Delilah Dirk for exactly the same reasons. All right. That was number 7. Number 8. And this one is there for a couple of reasons. One of them very obvious, and the other one's less so. Number 8 on my list is The Adventures of Herge, which I've mentioned, I think, in one of my shelf videos, but I haven't talked about in detail. This is a biography of Herge, the creator of Tintin. This is a very interesting biography because it is a fanciful biography. It's not to be taken as 100% history, but from the very first page, and I'm not sure if you'll get to see, but from the very first page, you start seeing references like this lady at the piano singing the Jewel song from Faust, and Herge, Georges Remy, he's just a little kid over here. So it's sort of like that movie Shakespeare in Love, where there are things taking place in the background and that's inspiration. You'll see him in the Scouts and he's throwing a lasso. And for fans of Tintin and for fans of the Adventures of Tintin, you'll be able to say, okay, that's the song that Bianca Castafiore sings, and that's what he did in Tintin in America, and that's that person. And look, those twins, that must be who Thompson and Thompson are based on. And it's not necessarily true. It's not necessarily like these are the people. That fancifulness being part of this storytelling, because you get to recognize these things from the comics that Herge made, that fancifulness is very obvious to you, that this is kind of made up but kind of true. And as the story goes on, it continues in that way, where he is actually a secret agent. Now, some parts of this might sound absolutely outlandish, and I think that's kind of the point, but it's also a pretty solid biography, not as long as you're not expecting an absolute, every single thing written over here is researched fact biography. It is researched, but a lot of it is then experimented with. And I think that's what makes it such a great comic. So you can come to it thinking that you're going to get a Tintin pastiche. And actually, one of the things I did think about for this video was that, should I make it a list of Tintin pastiches? Because there are many out there, but that's a separate list. I don't necessarily think that a Tintin pastiche or a Tintin spoof or an Asterix pastiche or an Asterix parody or spoof is the logical next step in reading comics once you've read Tintin and Asterix. I think you can come back to that once you've read many more comics, but maybe it's a little too insular and maybe it's a little too circular to start over there. But this isn't that. This is definitely done in the style of a Tintin comic, as you can see, and that adds to its charm. But why I think this is an interesting book to put on this list is because, first of all, this is the only book that even gets close to being a non-fiction comic. So you do want to introduce readers to the fact that comics aren't only about fiction. It's not only about fantasy, but it can be, and what better way to do it than to say the biography of the person that you really enjoyed the comics of, in comics form, done in their style, with a little bit of fancifulness thrown in. So that's clever because A, it's telling you that comics can be biographies, comics can be non-fiction, and B, it's telling you that even non-fiction can be creative, and it's not only one type of documentary approach that is non-fiction. You can have all kinds of area between absolute fact as recorded in a trial, transcript, and absolute fiction. In between that, there can be so much. And that's what I like about this as a comic to give to people who have read Tintin and Asterix and say, read more about the creator, but also find out more about comics and have that balance of something familiar, something that looks, feels to you like something, this could be from the cover of the Castafiore Emerald or something like that. Something that looks familiar to you, and then find that, no, there's other stuff going on over here. There's other things that are being introduced to me, like the idea of nonfiction and the idea of playing around with the truth in order to tell a particular kind of story. So that's number 8, The Adventures of Herge. All right, I have only 2 comics left, and this is going to be really quick and easy. Probably the number 9 is going to be the most adult or grown-up story, just because I wanted to move in that direction at least a little bit. So 9 and 10 are the more grown-up ones, and I would say Corto Maltese. There can be many other comics that could be in this place. And again, once you start talking about European comics, with that kind of general European comics, it is a universe out there. So are you talking about Italian comics? Are you talking about French comics, Belgian comics, German comics? We've got all of that out there. So why did I pick Corto Maltese? A, because it's adventure. There's travel. There's a fair amount of nautical themes in it. These are all things that when I think of Asterix and when I think about Asterix and Tintin, these are things that come up over there. There is this approach to countries and lands in Corto Maltese that seems like sort of an extension of things that we have seen over there. But at the same time, it is a more mature work and it is a more complex look at the world. The character, Corto Maltese, is he really doesn't care too much for flags and countries and armies and things like that. He is a man who believes he's a citizen of the world, and he also has some really stringent thoughts on religion and people's beliefs making them do things. But there is a core humaneness to his approach, which I found to be quite similar to the heroes of Tintin adventures and Asterix adventures. I found that to be a sort of link, but it seems like a natural extension of those themes into something a little bit more serious, into something a little bit more adult. The Corto Maltese stories also do have differing styles and differing subject matter, and some of those may not fit into this larger adventure, recurring characters coming up sort of familiarity that we enjoy. But I think that's also interesting, where you can say even Herge had a fair amount of experimentation. There are the later Tintin comics that didn't quite feel like the earlier Tintin comics. There are a number of people, readers, fans, who don't like the later stories as much as they like the earlier stories. I mean, the Red Sea Sharks, I think most people would say, is a masterpiece, but the Castafiore Emerald is not unanimously loved. Flight 714 is not unanimously loved. Tintin and the Picaros is not universally loved, but they're all bold stories. They're all trying to do different things and trying to do different genres and different approaches to the Shaggy Dog story and things like that. And I think that's the way Corto Maltese is also. It does establish itself in one particular identity. Again, a very similar identity to Lucky Luke or Clint Eastwood, the laconic, tall guy who wanders from place to place. In India, I say Corto Maltese would have been played by, a young Amitabh Bachchan from Sholay or something like that. It's that kind of a character. But as the stories go on, you do get other sides of him, you do get other sides of the world, and like Delilah Dirk, you do get stuff about politics, you do get stuff about power at the periphery of things, and you've got this independent character. And I think, although Tintin started off being very much an establishment person and very much talking about the kind of things that Herge wanted to lecture about or his publishers wanted to lecture about and stuff like that, by the end of the adventures, by the end of this, he was a much more idiosyncratic, a much more emotionally driven, from Tintin in Tibet to Tintin in Picaros, more involved with his friends, more involved in, I don't care about my safety and I'm going to make sure this happens, and then having a moral code that supersedes national interests and politics and things like that. And definitely in the Asterix and Obelix stories, you've got this, we want to be who we are. We want to drink, we want to eat wild boar, we want to beat each other up, and we're not going to be civilized. We're not going to have the Romans take over everything. There's going to be one pocket of resistance. And it's that sort of idea of that individualistic almost resistance to these larger forces that will otherwise just make everything smoothened out and cleaned and my way or the highway sort of thing. It's that sort of resistance that I think is one of those hidden appeals of both the Tintin and Asterix adventures. And that's the part of Corto Maltese that I think links directly up, that kind of resistance to the way you guys want to do things and the way you have decided that these are the important things for you, how much land you own and how much money you have and what does that make you do to each other. Those are the kind of things that I think are extremely interesting. And the other thing about Corto Maltese is a lot of these comics, especially the older ones, I think a lot of them will have some problems with the depiction of other cultures, other races, the way they live, and there's a fair amount of judgment that one could see in there if you wanted to. It might be coming across as humor, it might be coming across as, and I made the point in my Asterix video where everyone is crazy, according to Obelix. It's every single culture they meet is crazy. But then he also does say these Gauls are crazy, and he thinks that they're crazy as well. So it seems an equal opportunity offense. But you do have those things in many of these stories. What I loved about Corto Maltese is that you see something and you get something and you say, that's another one of those problematic depictions. That's another one of those ways of thinking and ways of putting things across. And the story pulls the rug from under your feet. And it's not that. And you feel at the work that at least the way I felt, I was like, well, Mr. Hugo Pratt, well done indeed. There I was, getting on my high horse and standing on this soapbox, all ready to let go. And then you gave me the story, which is a much more complex one and a much more clear-eyed view of the thing that you yourself are using, which is a particular kind of depiction. Superb writing, and I think important writing at times like the ones we live in. So that's my number 9. And yes, the art style, the writing, it matches so well together. I think I heard someone say that they didn't like the art style of Corto Maltese, but it's something that where did I put it? It's something that really works for me. This black and white art style, but the chiaroscuro, the negative space, the composition, even the action over here. This is not, martial arts fighting, but it feels violent. The kicks feel like they land. The punches feel like they land. And you can, of course, go from here to other masters like Sergio Topi, Munoz, people I've just started discovering myself. Fantastic, beautiful stuff. Come for the art, stay for the anti-nationalistic writing. All right, that is number 9, Corto Maltese by Hugo Pratt. I do have a list of honorable mentions, but those are going to be for another list. So we're almost done with the thing. Sleepy reader, welcome. We're almost done. For a change, I'm sort of keeping myself on schedule. But anyone joining now, of course, you can go back and watch the recording and go over all of the rambling. The last book on my thing is probably going to be seen by many people as my silliest choice, but I did think about this comic almost immediately, and then I dismissed it, saying that's silly, that's ridiculous. But I couldn't get it out of my head, which is always when you know that you must have something pretty good. So I thought about it, and I thought about it some more, and it seems to me to be obvious. One, the number 10 book on my list, the number 10 comic that I would recommend to someone looking for something else to read, an adult, or, I mean, I wouldn't recommend this to a young reader, just the way I wouldn't recommend Corto Maltese to a young reader, but because of its universality, because of its accessibility, because of its availability, all of the things that have applied to the books before, but also because it is so entertaining, it is so rich, it is so textured, it is so fun. I would have to say it is Hellboy. I would recommend Hellboy as the next comic to read after Tintin and Asterix. And I don't really see why not. So it's adventure stories. It's episodic to begin with. Longer world and arcs come into play. It has a wonderful mixture of character and plot driving these stories. The artwork by Mignola and others is superb and just gets better and better as the series goes on. And there's really very little to object to about Hellboy. There's really very little that I can criticize. I mean, you could say, I don't like that kind of story, and that can be a dismissal, but I always find that a weak dismissal if someone says, I don't like things with science, I don't like science fiction, I don't like fantasy, I don't like horror. I can understand why, particular with something like horror. If someone says I don't like horror movies, I know what they're talking about, but they're not necessarily talking about everything that is possible. They're talking about what there has been the most of. I think no matter what you think of Hellboy, if you haven't read Hellboy, you should just read Hellboy. You shouldn't listen to anyone, including me, no, that's not true. Listen to me talk about it, but read Hellboy. It is lean, it is slick, it feels like it moves at a mile a minute. It has an incredible mythology and lore, but it comes to you in pieces, and it comes to you a little bit at a time. As a complex comic, it's fantastic. As a simple comic, it's fantastic. As a beginner comic, it's fantastic, and as an advanced reader comic, it's fantastic. There are very few comics, I think, that can hit all of those ways, and there's something about the minimalism and the leanness that I mentioned of Hellboy that gives it that ability to do that. So I would definitely say that when you've got someone who has enjoyed the location by location change that you've got in Asterix and Tintin, when you've seen the heroism of being put into ridiculous situations and then solving it the way you know how. Either you take some potion and beat some people up, or you use your brains and you manipulate the situation, or you deduct your way out of it. All of these things are there in Hellboy, just evolved to the next level of long form serial storytelling. But the serial storytelling will also be, it's interspersed with standalone stories. It'll be interspersed with character moments, and those short stories and those smaller little moments that flesh out the larger world are, I think, among the most valuable things that Hellboy as a series has. So yeah, that will be my number 10 book to read after Tintin and Asterix, for you or for someone for someone who's looking for things. So I hope that in going through this big pile of books, there has been something for everyone, which is what I was intending to have. I hope that there are some comics over here that you hadn't heard of, that you've heard of for the first time. I'm sure that you've got a lot of lists for books that I should be reading. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, I could easily make another video like this, and I could make this a series of videos. So leave all of your suggestions of what you think, using my parameters, using the things that I've used, or maybe of your own. Find the things that are the anchors and find the things that are the new. Get that highly scientific balance between your familiar and discovery. And let me have your suggestions. Keep them in the comments, keep them in the chat. And anyone watching later, as I said before, do check the comments and the chats for other lists other than mine. And maybe I'll steal people's lists and put them into my next video. But thank you so much for joining me. This is a very quick live stream by my standards. It's not even been 2 hours, but that's because I said I'm going to restrict myself to 10 and not get carried away. And the fact that I came in under 20 comics, I think, is an absolute triumph, even if you don't agree with me. Thanks so much for joining me for this live stream. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next video.